sir.
So let's start with this. Tell us. Let's start with you, Phil. What brought you? Phil was from Indianapolis.
I'm a transplant.
He's a transplant. So
Transplant.
what brought you to Detroit? When did you come?
I had a job offer. Every time I move somewhere, I have a job offer. People don't realize it sometimes, but I had a job offer from a guy by the name of Sam Sanders, who was what we call straw boss for a group that was backing Motown acts. What was the name of the group? It was called Swingin' Dashikis. And so in 1968, Sam brought a band down to Indianapolis, and I had a habit of going by this club and sitting in with whoever was playing there. Mm-hmm. That's how I really met and hooked up with Wes Montgomery, years before that. But fast forward, in 1968, Sam had a band down there. It must have been probably August, September of '68. And, I sit in with him and he said, "Hey, man, you sound pretty good, man. You doing anything much around here?" And I said, "Not really." Because everybody in Indianapolis had a day job, all the musicians. Even Wes Montgomery had a day job, if you can imagine that. But he said, "Well, if you come to Detroit, look me up, and I can hook you up, So I took him up for it, and man, it was November of that year, I moved to Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
And 2 weeks later, I'm back in Indianapolis, Indiana, playing with the Temptations, because, that's the way it happened.
Yeah. So you, when you got up here, you were working immediately.
Immediately.
Uh-huh. And tell me a little bit about when you got to Detroit, you noticed immediately a kind of a cultural difference within the African American community between Detroit and Indianapolis. I want you to talk a little bit about what you noticed.
Immediately, I noticed the fact that there was a black pride here, even though the uprising had happened maybe less than a year or around a year earlier, but in the black community, there's businesses, thriving businesses, and people were doing things, where back in Indianapolis, it was kind of suppressed, in terms of any black-owned businesses. We had the Avenue there, which was big, had a place there called Sunset Terrace. It brought in all kinds of bands, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Charlie Parker, Miles, all of them played there, But as far as the community itself, it was just like basically working. Not a lot of black-owned businesses, but here in Detroit, that was happening. So
right.
I was impressed by that.
There was a sense of an identity, an African-American cultural identity within the black community in Detroit that was not present, you felt, in Indianapolis, right?
And the other thing that I had going for me is I met Wendell, in '64, and in that same band was Marcus Belgrade. So when I got here, I immediately hooked up with Marcus, who hooked me up with Harold McKinney, so I was working with 6, 7 different bands, Some I hadn't done back there, I couldn't make a living playing music in Indianapolis. So all of a sudden, I was able to make, is that hum? Can we do something about the hum? Anyway, all of a sudden, I was able to thrive off of music alone, My dad had a business in Indianapolis that I was kind of running, so,
What business was that?
We had a concrete business. I said it wasn't a lot of businesses, but just right off, I forgot, I was involved in business with my dad, who had the concrete plant.
Right, but it's interesting that, there was a sense of there was an African-American community with an identity, and something like tribe or strata, or any of these self-determination services, they grow out of something. That's, everything, it's really important to remember that what happened in Detroit was not random. It grows out of a particular place, particular culture, particular economic, social, cultural conditions, and particular people that make this stuff happen. Wendell,
Now, Phil, I met Phil on the road.
you met Phil. Who were you working with when you met him?
I was working with Hank Crawford. I think I met Phil in about 65.
No, sooner than that.
64, he says.
About 60.
Right.
What's the difference? At our age, at our age. But anyway, 64, let's say. And I was traveling with Johnny Coles. Johnny Coles was in the band, and Phil DeFloyd, not Marcus yet. We hadn't picked up, at that time, we hadn't picked up Marcus.
Phil was living in Indianapolis
Really? So some of this stuff runs together.
Of course. Well, it's a lot of years. It's a lot of years later.
It's a lot of detail. His details is a little different from mine.
What's important, I think, is that Phil comes to Detroit in 1968, and you come back to Detroit where you had been born.
Right. But the same thing happened to Marcus. I met him on the road with Hank Crawford. Both of these guys was here in Detroit when I arrived in the city, and they had been working for 2-3 years, and I never knew what happened to these guys.
What brought you back to Detroit?
Well, I came back here from arrest as a sabbatical, as it were, from a drug habit that I had accumulated with working with several bands. Hank Crawford is one of them, and I was trying to clean up. And my parents was instrumental in seeking help for me. Marcus Belgrave and my mother, especially, sought out an institution that helped me clean up myself, which is Synanon. So I went to Synanon in California. This is like in '68, and I got clean from their rehabilitation program. I learned at that place. I learned about real estate and learned about nonprofit business.
While you were there, you were doing reading, right?
Reading a whole lot, and then also they found out I could play. They found out I could play, and Art Pepper was there, Esther Phillips, and a lot of jazz musicians and entertainers, as well as doctors and lawyers. And I was able to do a recording for Epic with Esther Phillips and a lot of George Bohannon and a bunch of people from LA for Synanon. It was called Prince of Peace. And I played several solos on that particular album.
When you came back to Detroit, though, I just want to get to this.
I'm not back yet.
Okay.
This is in '68. I'm coming back in '70.
Okay.
Wait on me. So I got this idea about business. I got this idea about writing cantatas. Like in musicals with singers and orchestrating and whatnot, built up my skills in terms of orchestration. And finally I came back to Detroit in '70, just to pass through here. I wasn't planning on staying. I was planning on going back.
Back to New York?
Yeah. But I didn't know how I was going to feel when I would go back to the same neighborhood in New York. So as I contemplated on what I was going to do, Marcus and Harold McKinney gave me a job teaching at Metro Arts. And that's where we started teaching folks like Marion Hayden, Racy Biggs, a whole bunch of people. Then I reconnected with Phil again, you know.
Because I was working there too.
Yeah, you was working there
So
with the dashikis, and
Metro-
that was the center for the
Metro.
Metro Arts.
right.
So Metro Arts was a federally funded, Lyndon Johnson Great Society program
Trickle down.
that was located basically on the same spot where the Detroit School of Arts is, right behind Orchestra Hall, right?
Right across the street from Strata.
Right across the street from Strata on Selden. And
Actually, I'm teaching at the same building. The School for Performing Arts.
yeah,
I'm teaching that same building.
in that same building now, 50 years later almost. But they had, there was instruction in music, dance, and all of the arts. And so a lot of jazz musicians, including Marcus Belgrave and Harold McKinney and these gentlemen, were able to work there and teach. And that is where you guys basically hooked up.
Yeah, so we started actually playing in different groups and whatnot. And Phil and myself at that particular time was saying we should present our music, periodically, because we actually are basically composers. So I got a relationship happening with the DIA, Detroit Institute of Arts, and we started planning different concerts there. But to actually generate the funds, we had a program book. We had and we sold advertisement for it. We had a lot of people that was interested in seeing these shows, and it was willing to help us in terms of selling ads and tickets, and we had a heck of a support group because all of us came back. Phil had worked for Motown; they knew about him. Marcus was working for Motown around, so the guys had names, and they wanted to help us to do performances and recordings, but at this time, performances. So we got a lot of people to sell ads and sell tickets to a program book, which evolved into a magazine. Now, you see, I just brought a few copies from our archives. So give those back when you get through. Yep. Other than that, that'll kill me.
Wendell, let me
Go ahead.
ask you then. So, there's this idea that we want to present our own music as composers, and let's do something at the DIA. My question is, where did the spark come to start an organization, like to formalize it? As you're talking to each other, what led to, let's create an organization? Did you have a model in mind, Phil? Did something you were drawing upon, or was it?
It was in three different stages.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated because, we started performing. Wendell had the W. Harrison Foundation or whatever it was called. So we're doing these things at the DIA, and, we talking and we playing each other's music. And so then we said, man, maybe we should record this, or something like that. So that's when Tribe really started out. To tell you the truth, I got the papers upstairs. It started out as a partnership between Wendell and I, like Tribe, like officially January of 1972.
Right.
And then later the records came out.
Which was after that, for the first concert you had done as an organization was back in August, I think, of 71.
Right.
So it was a kind of a natural progression.
Yeah.
But was there was there an aha moment ever? Or
let me express this. As far as I'm concerned, we were kind of learning as we went along. We didn't have in my mind, we didn't have a concrete plan, but we knew, where we want. We saw the lights at the end of the tunnel. We knew where we wanted to go, but it took, like some real improvisation to get there, and we ended up, developing, as the records came out, we developed, some distribution and a little promotion, and it was kind of accepted around here in Detroit as far as getting some airplay. Our cuts were a little long and a little out.
For radio?
For radio, but we managed to get some. So, what's your take on it?
Well, I got a different take.
Okay. As usual.
I have, the infrastructure, we had to build infrastructure for everything, Now, next door to my mother lived a PR guy and a promotion guy that worked for the churches. And he was, his name was Goldman Green, stayed right next door to my mother. And he was promoting church concerts, gospel music, every quarter. And he had a methodology in terms of generating advertisement and promotion and whatnot. He would like solicit different businesses and sell ads to program books. But he was always working in outside of the community, outside of Detroit. His wife wanted him to come back and work with us and show us how to do it. Because I didn't know how to, I knew a little bit about nonprofit business from Synanon.
Right.
But I didn't know about this method that he had in terms of generating funds to promote concerts. Because he would generate funds in promoting gospel presentations, and he would generate enough money to pay all the artists as well as himself and pay his own personal bills. He did pretty good. He drove around in Cadillacs. He's a real promotional kind of guy, So anyway, he let his wife show us. He kind of like mentored myself and my wife at the time about how to fundraise, and even got my mother involved. Because but bear in mind, they wanted me to stay in Detroit.
Your mother.
My mother, and she talked Harold and Marcus to try to get me to stay here. Help! I need help with my son. So all this activity was something that it really kept me busy, and it was a trap. My trap was set. I didn't know at the time. I only found that out 10 years later, when all this stuff had accumulated into a record label, a magazine, a publishing company, and I was just staying busy, and I contemplated on going back to New York after 10 years. I said, well, wait a minute, I can't go back to New York with all this stuff. I never would be able to accumulate all this stuff in New York, So I'm here.
So as this thing is sort of evolving, then into an organization. I mean, you formally create Tribe in January of 1972, and you begin doing more concerts and starting the recording and all of these things. I wonder, first of all, you were aware, yes, of like the AACM in Chicago or Strata just down the street. Were these places influences in any way?
No, really not. Not as far as I'm
We didn't know
concerned.
nothing about it.
I didn't really know.
I was trying to stay busy.
Right.
Now, Phil might have knew something about
No,
it.
I didn't know anything about it. All I knew is that we needed a product. We needed a gigantic calling card to get some work. So that was the main objective, in my mind, was to keep working, to get some work. So, if you had a record, at least back then, if you had a record, you stood chance, of acquiring work. So that was, that was the main reason, inspiration behind that.
And the key thing was presenting a united front where everybody that knew
This is the original.
us, That's the time is now. They came out in
Can I pass that around?
74,
Can I pass it around?
73.
73.
I'm gonna pass it.
The third release.
Yeah,
Yeah.
be careful, this stuff is valuable now.
Yeah. So the main thing, I was getting back to the infrastructure. We had to find an organization and deal with a nonprofit as well as that generates income to actually pay for the concert series. That paid for like about 8 to 10 musicians and sometimes an advertisement or whatnot. Now I'm talking about the magazine. I'm not talking about records, you know. And the guy that was really instrumental in helping us was Herb Boyd.
Herb Boyd was at that point was a young writer and editor and a teacher. He was the first, I believe he started the African American Studies program at Wayne State in the late 60s, early 70s as a very young man. Herb is still on the scene, just wrote a book a couple of years ago, a great book called Black Detroit, History of African Americans in Detroit, and still writes a weekly column for the Amsterdam News, African American paper in New York.
Teaches at Queens.
Teaches at Queens, and he was nice enough to write a nice blurb for me on the back of my book, so he's still very involved. So Herb at that point was a catalyst and was involved with Ken Cox and Charles Moore at Strata, and he was involved with you guys, and he was the editor of the Tribe magazine.
He started out as an editor. I became the editor.
The executive editor, you were.
Well, he got so busy.
You were the editor.
Yeah.
He got so busy, but he just wrote the liner notes for the latest album that came out.
That's right, and Herb just wrote liner notes for the new record that's coming. So,
Oh, really?
so in that era,
You didn't know
That's
that?
why it was discretionary. Dates are very important. You know, sometimes our memory doesn't allow us to be accurate. And I like accuracy with dates, you know, as best you can, you know. But anyway.
I want to ask you about in that era, how conscious were you of politics and the politics of the era, and what was the influence of the political culture in the city as in which you are working?
Oh, okay. Are you speaking of world politics, or are you just speaking?
However, I'm curious as to what you guys were thinking about, and what the culture was like when Tribe was getting going and the music was getting going. I understand you were trying to work, and you know there was an economic imperative to do what you do as a jazz musician, but that was happening within a cultural context that was had evolved in certain ways from the late 60s into the early 70s. And I wonder how you think about that
We
era.
always going to be involved with politics whether we want it or not. You know, we got redlining in the neighborhood. We still have the police brutality. We have all these things that was happening back then that's still happening today. And it was happening before then, you know. So we were living it all the time. And Nixon was, Richard Nixon was in office. So a lot of programs was cut at that particular time. So we had to do this a certain way on our own. And we had those, like Herb Boyd had a lot of journalist students that was in his class
Wayne State.
at Wayne State that wanted to write for the magazine because he was involved. And this is like an outlet for his students, the magazine. And that's really the reason the issue was so effective, because it related to like real life.
Yeah, and the community embraced it, you know.
Yeah.
And the magazine was also generating work for a lot of people who had a lot of skills that had given up on them, you know, in terms of writing and whatever, graphic arts or whatever. And through the magazine, they were able to, you know, acquire work and, you know.
Yeah, we had photographers, graphic artists.
You know, people.
writers.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm getting at with this is that you guys start this organization as a creative outlet for your music, but one of the things that ends up happening is that you're also creating a community, right? And
We're reflecting the community.
reflecting it, but also creating a community in terms of providing work for other people.
Yeah.
The magazine and the concerts provide a kind of focus for people that are interested in either politics or culture. And there's an intersection of those things that's happening with Tribe as sort of, if you think of Tribe as being in the middle of this, culture, politics, Detroit, all of these things are kind of flow through the Tribe organization in a very interesting way. You don't start out to do that, but that's what kind of happens.
We
found out we
didn't
had to-
realize it at the time, but we were creating a movement in a sense. We were really revolutionaries. Things were happening that, we were certainly aware of all the wrongs that were going on in not only in Detroit but in the whole world. So that was a reflection of some of the magazines, touched upon those issues,
Right.
So as a result of all that, people grab a hold of that when they see that, you're trying to do rights and wrongs and,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. So,
I want to read, this is from Phil's, the record, The Time Is Now, which is getting passed around, but Phil wrote these notes on the back, and this gives you a good flavor for the period. And he writes, "The time is now," now capitalized with 2 exclamation points. "The time is now. The time is now for unity among the people. The time is now for all men to be able to control their own destinies. The time is now for oppression, racism, greed, hate, and poverty to end. The time is now for revolution. This recording itself is part of the revolution, and the whole purpose behind this self-determination venture is survival. Survival for the musicians, his music, and thus survival for you, the listeners and demanders of the creative black art form that has been labeled jazz." So you get a sense of the urgency with which this music was created. And you can hear that in the music. I mean, the energy and the fire that you hear in the music is a direct outgrowth of these ideas that are sort of floating in the air. Sometimes I think that musicians today everybody puts out their own records. I mean, that's part of the way it works today. But that was not true when you guys were doing this.
No.
And
That was the reason why we did it. If you had a record, you wanted to put it out, it wouldn't be accepted in terms of a radio or a distributor. You couldn't get distribution. You couldn't hardly get anybody to really write about it because they was looking for a catalog. You had to have a catalog. You had to be representing a company, whether small or large. It had to be a company. So we came together as a necessity to actually get our music out. And we, at the same time, each producer owned his own product, and as well as publishing. Everybody had their own publishing. And we used the Tribe record label as a conduit or umbrella for all these individual artists. We came together. We financed, each individual financed their own product. And then when we take it to a record label, we took a catalog to not record label, but radio station or distributor, and we was welcomed with open arms.
right, because you were something.
Yeah.
They could see it was in a form that they recognized as,
was
this
united.
is legitimate.
Yeah, we had to legitimize ourselves by coming together in a company.
Yeah.
So so it made names for a lot of us. A lot of us was like glorified sidemen on record labels, for other artists, other main artists. And we did a lot of writing for them and recording for them. And oftentimes the company would promise us they was going to do a record on us, but it never came. You know, in fact, Motown actually did something on Marcus and Benny Maupin and George Bohannon, and put it on, they recorded it and they put it on the shelf and never did put it out. Atlantic recorded 2 of my tunes, actually 2 tunes. I recorded a tune by Gloria Lynn, I Wish You Love, and another tune. And they was reworking, they called themselves working on my album. Never did happen. Never did happen. So anyway, we was getting up in age. We can't wait on this stuff. And the other thing, we still up in age. But to see
Well, we ain't
now,
gonna go backwards.
Right.
now is the idea. Why wait? I was with Sun Ra, and Sun Ra didn't wait on anybody to validate him as a musician or artist. You know, and I worked with Sun Ra, and I saw this when I was 20 years old.
Yeah.
So I had a concept of actually doing it yourself. Sun Ra had two record labels, a publishing company. He had his own managing arm, and he was his own, and he built his own fan base.
Right.
So he wasn't obligated to no one but his fans, whatnot. So I said, well, we can do this here in Detroit.
Right.
But it went all over. Our first hit was in Poland, you know, in terms of mass, a demand was in Poland for our music.
Oh, that's really true, you know. Oh, that's really true, but I think we got a real boost when John Hughes decided to do reissues of Vibes from the Tribe and Time Is Now. And then from that point on, we started getting a lot of play from people wanting to license our music.
No, P-Vine was first. That just came, P-Vine, I signed P-Vine in 93. This didn't come in until 2000.
So yeah, I mean, basically though, what they're talking about here is that they make
And
these
soul
records.
jazz.
They make these records in the 1970s,
Right.
and they sell a few copies, and they get a little bit of distribution, not as much as you would have wanted. But much later, you know, people had known about them and these records, and as companies in England and Europe, Japan, and elsewhere began to get interested, they were able to license this material.
But they got it from the main distributor that distributed stuff to Europe and Japan was Jim Gray.
Don't say Rick Ballard, please.
Yes, in California. But Jim Gray distributed a lot of our stuff in Europe, which generated the demand for license agreements.
Right.
And then we got a call from P-Vine in Japan, and we got a call from Soul Jazz in the early 90s.
So so it's interesting that you know, it took a long time, but you have generated income
We
over
fooled
the
them. We outlived what they thought we were.
right. I mean, you know, it's 50 years later almost here, and these records, this music is still has first of all, the music itself has an artistic vitality, but it's still valid in the commercial marketplace, which is, you know, I mean, what a gift, right? That all these years later, and that you guys are still here to at least cash a few checks.
Now we're trying to bring younger people in, and to keep the legacy going in terms of new recordings, new ideas, and whatnot. And now we have 10 other labels that license. We have two labels in Japan, Ultra Vibe in Japan, and P-Vine. We have a label in Switzerland, label in Belgium, a label in, we got 2 here. We got Ubiquity here, and I don't have my list.
Well,
now,
I'm curious about a couple of things. There are a few students in the room, and I wonder, Phil, a few students in the room. And Phil, I wonder if you could, as you talk to these kids, what do you think if any, are there lessons from what you guys have done with Tribe? Are there lessons for these kids about what they could or how they should think about the business and the industry or their own careers based on your own experience? What would you tell them?
Wow, it's a lot different. It's a very difficult business, but main thing is Harold McKinney always said, get everything in writing, because it's essential.
Everybody hear that? Get everything in writing?
Get everything in writing. Like this one here, I didn't get that in writing, but it came out, and I liked it, and I'm on it, Huh? It's a remake of Vibes from the Tribe, just the title track, right? So, back to your question of, yeah.
Yeah, are there lessons from what you guys did that these kids should take note of? Or if there is, what are the main lessons that these kids should take note of, thinking about what you accomplished with Tribe?
I don't really have the answer. I don't want to. What would you say, Wendell?
I'm listening to you. No. The main thing is, it's a new world now. It's a new industry now. When we was doing this, it wasn't an internet. We had to do it a certain way. A certain paradigm that was already out there that we had to adhere to. We had vinyl. Artist names. If you had a record, one record, that would allow you to work all over the world because you had mass distribution. If you say, we had Tribe had about 15 different distributors at that particular time. That were eventually got to that point, and then we started licensing. But now you can put your a record out. It's kind of a blessing and a curse because all kinds of stuff can be put out there in the marketplace, good or bad, and you don't have to have. Before you had to be cognizant of how it sounded, and you had to be cognizant of the quality because you had producers and people on the radio or distributors wouldn't distribute anything unless it had a certain quality of sound. Nowadays, without the distributors, you can do your own distribution. You got your own production company. You got your own recording studio. There's no rules in terms of if you might not know music at all, but you can still put out a jazz album and call yourself a jazz musician.
It's certainly the technology allows people to do it yourself today in a way that you could not do in the early 70s, where you were working within an industry infrastructure that you had to figure out how to navigate. That doesn't exist. But the idea that I think that you did it yourself, we're still in an era, these musicians still have to, if people are not going to do it for you, you're going to have to do it. And
but my point was you had to do it a certain way for it to be accepted.
Right.
It was still guidelines and rules and aesthetics.
Right.
We just couldn't just put anything out there. We had credibility.
The thing that you have to make sure, though, that everything that you do, you should have everything in place in terms of what's going to happen after you get this in your hand. You can't wait to get this in your hand to figure out how to have, promotion behind it. An agent if it's going to be a working band, it's going to go to work. You have to have all these things in place. You can't wait. I've made mistakes all my life with that because I had a real good record that came out, and I was getting all kinds of play. I was getting airplay. It was scaring me to death. I had no distribution. I mean, I'm not talking of Tribe now, but when I moved to California, I came out with this CD called A Close Encounter of the Very Best Kind. It was played on the jazz station there, like it was in the top 20 for the top 20 for like 16 straight weeks, and I had not an ounce of distribution. And they were announcing that you could go buy this record at all the major stores there.
And you couldn't.
And you couldn't. So, yeah. And I didn't have an agent, but it was.
Well, it's the music business.
It's the music
I mean,
business.
there's music, and then there's business, and so you know what I want to do? I want to give people a chance if anybody has any questions. We got about 5 minutes, and but if anybody has any questions for these gentlemen, then this is your chance. If you have anything for me, I'm happy to field things, but Phil doesn't get out here very often from California, and
I
Phil.
want to take my book back with me.
Oh yeah, I'm giving him. Yeah, he's getting a book.
Oh, mention the magazine. Could you guys hand the magazine back?
So he doesn't get too nervous.
Yeah.
Put it in your
But
bag.
does I'll get it.
Those are
I'll get it.
my archives.
Anybody have any
Don't
questions
get
though for these guys? Yes, no. If you don't, I'm going to ask them something.
Oh, thank you. Really appreciate that. The documentation.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you guys have any advice for like young musicians like us, like musically, like outside of the music business, but just like
Musically? What I heard today, Michigan State has got the dynamite educational program. I experienced that in the last couple of days, playing with the ensemble and hearing you guys play.
I didn't hear the question.
And-
What was
and
the question?
He was talking about musical. He was talking about recite it. Do it again.
I was
Say
wondering
it
if
again.
they could give us any like musical advice, like outside of the music business, just like purely music.
He's asking if they have any musical advice.
What do you play?
I play bass.
That's a hard question, especially when I haven't heard you. That's a hard question. In terms of
Practice. It's kind of like it's a cliche, but practice.
There are no
what
secrets.
what kind of issues are you dealing with? Give us some.
I'm just trying to play bebop right now, like learn the language and stuff.
Well, who do you listen to?
Oscar Pettiford, like my favorite. Oscar Pettiford, Paul Chambers.
Oscar Pettiford.
Pettiford, Paul Chambers.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Can you transcribe any of the solos or the way he walks through the changes, his approach to walking the changes? Yeah, that's basic stuff right there. That gives you a foundation.
Yeah.
And what class are you in? Are you in the band? You're in the band. Are you in Mr.
Yeah, he plays in Randy's ensemble.
Randy Gillespie?
Randy,
No Randy Napoleons.
Oh,
ensemble. He's the
okay.
bass player today.
Very good. Very good. Very good. What I heard was good. Well, you look different. Great bass players that played today.
Any other questions for these guys? Yes.
I was wondering if you had any advice for young musicians moving to New York City and getting work there.
He's asking about advice for any young musicians moving to New York and getting
Well,
work there.
When I moved to New York, I had people that talked about me, which enabled me to get local jobs,
It ain't like that
And,
no more.
Of course, that was back then.
Back then it's 1960.
Yeah. In terms of going to New York, back then we had to do that. It was like taking your piggy to market. So to the marketplace. But like I said before, with the internet now, you don't have to move there to work, to learn. You don't have to move there to get recorded so much. It was a necessity back in the 40s and 50s and 60s when I was coming out. The main thing is if you, like this, the economy here is picking up. You can work around Michigan. You might be able to work more here than you can work in New York, because the market is up, the economy is up more here now at this particular time. The deal is working as much as you can. If you go to New York, you think you can work, that's the real deal. Wherever you can work.
See, that's right. Because the thing is now, you don't have to be based in New York or LA. I mean, you can do everything that you need to do anywhere in the country or in the world, actually.
If you can work there.
If you can work
If you can work there.
And
So if you can't work in New York, and you working here and going to school, this is your best bet right now, And you have to take it a day at a time, But the key in terms of being a good musician and is really developing your craft and learn how to play different ways, learn how to write, These teachers are a good example in terms of writing and composing and stuff like that. Yeah, Michigan State is great.
Yeah. These guys are doing a great job with like the students here are very, very, very fortunate, with Rodney's program.
I have a question. I was in Detroit in the early 70s. I went to Strata. I also went to EBO. Were you guys connected with
Yeah.
EBO at all? Were you connected with Club Mozambique?
What's his name?
Really super hip spots.
Biagas was the guy that owned EBO. Over on 6 Mile, McNichols and Third. We did with Bill Cosby. We did a train tribute there with Bill Cosby and.
I played there with Gerald Wilson came in town and put together a band there and the EBO.
Mike Biagas, he was a school teacher, but he would produce a concert series at the EBO, that brought some people in out of town and produced a lot of local groups and whatnot. EBO and what? Bakers? You said
There's a club called
Club Mozambique.
Oh,
God.
yeah. And what was the club next door to it?
Jazz West.
Jazz West,
Yeah, maybe that was it.
Played there with Ross and Kirk. Well, at the Mozambique,
Spanky Wilson. Spanky played with Spanky.
Yeah, with
Mark's
Spanky.
point there, Detroit, that was pretty tumultuous times, and there was a lot of conflict going on. There was
I played there with Ross and Kirk one night, though.
also racism was really bad, but the music was great.
Yeah, you talking about
Early 70s.
Early
72 or something like that?
73, 74.
Yeah.
I was at the Mingus show that was captured recently.
Estrada? Down the Strata?
Yeah, at the Strata. That was like, I told Rodney, he asked me about my music experience. That's one of the best shows I ever saw, like Mingus.
Yeah.
Conducting that group with ferocious intensity, it was just great.
And that was a Strata gallery,
so
and the Mingus and Herbie and Freddie Hubbard would play that, and we had Metro Arts across the street, and they would come and talk to the kids across the street while they was playing at the gallery, and that was a very beautiful exchange, a beautiful time, in that particular.
Let's thank Wendell Harrison and Phil Ranelin
Thank you.
for a lifetime of work.
I have one question.
And Phil has one
I have
question.
one question. Where's the time is now, right now?
Oh, he wants to make sure he
Rodney's
gets that
got that.
record back.
Rodney's
Rodney's
got
got
it.
it.
Oh,
We know where he is.
You got
Okay.
my record and my magazine.
Thanks everybody for coming, for listening to me, for listening to them.
Thank
And we'll see you.
All right, thank you.